Christmas used to feel like the one season in Springfield where everything soft in my life still had a place to land. I could remember being little and standing on a kitchen chair while my mother, Evelyn, guided my hands as we stirred apple pie filling, the air sweet with cinnamon and butter. My father, Robert, would be outside in the cold, humming off-key while he strung lights along the roofline, and my younger brother, Daniel, would shake wrapped boxes under the tree until Mom snapped his name and he laughed like he couldn't help himself. In those years, I believed warmth was something a house could hold forever, like light trapped inside glass. But slowly, without anyone ever announcing it, I became the background of our family's picture. Daniel's trophies multiplied, his grades became conversation starters, and my mother's pride began to orbit him the way a planet orbits the sun. I was still there, still useful, carrying decoration boxes, clearing plates, smiling for photos, but the compliments thinned, and the way people looked through me thickened. I learned how to be agreeable. I learned how to not take up space. I learned, most of all, that love in our house came with conditions, and the safest way to keep it was to never need it too loudly. By 29, I had already lived a life that looked impressive from the outside and hollow from the inside. My marriage hadn't exploded in one dramatic night. It unraveled the way fabric frays, thread by thread, until you can't pretend it's still strong. When I married Thomas Reynolds at 23, my parents acted like I'd completed a checklist that proved I was worth something. Thomas was charming, ambitious, and polished in the way that made my mother glow when she introduced him. In the beginning, we played the part beautifully. Dinner parties, posed smiles, holidays planned like photo shoots. Then came the late nights, the distracted kisses, the way his eyes lit up at his phone for reasons that had nothing to do with me. When I found the messages with the woman from his office, they weren't outright proof of an affair, but they were intimate enough to make my stomach drop. When I confronted him, he didn't soften. He called me needy. He called me dramatic. When I asked for counseling, he laughed like I'd suggested something embarrassing. The divorce drained me in every way possible. We fought over petty objects as if winning the coffee maker could erase losing the marriage. When the paperwork was finally signed in the summer, I drove back to Springfield with my life packed into the trunk and a silence inside me that felt heavier than my suitcases. I expected, at minimum, my parents to ask if I was okay. Instead, my mother asked what I had done wrong, as if a marriage ending could only be a woman's failure. My father said almost nothing at all, but the disappointment in his quiet was loud enough. Daniel, golden as ever, shrugged and said Thomas had always seemed like a good man. In that moment, I realized my family didn't see my pain as something to hold. They saw it as something that embarrassed them. I rented a tiny one-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Green's bakery on Main Street. It was barely big enough to turn around in, and the paint peeled in corners, but it belonged to me. Mrs. Green was 71, sharp-eyed and kind, and when she heard I was between jobs, she offered me a discount if I helped with bookkeeping once a week. The apartment always smelled faintly of fresh bread and cinnamon, a steady reminder that something good could keep being made, even when life felt broken. The first night I slept there, I sat on the edge of the bed, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, and listened to the ovens hum below me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to perform. I could be tired. I could be sad. I could be real. Then an email arrived from Dayton Digital Solutions, offering me a senior marketing coordinator role starting in January. I reread the message until the words started to feel like a hand on my back, steadying me. Someone believed I was capable, not because I was someone's wife or someone's daughter, but because of what I could do. I told Mrs. Green, and she beamed and promised she'd bake an extra pie in my honor. That night, hope didn't feel like a grand fantasy. It felt like a small, stubborn flame. Still, Springfield was Springfield. Gossip moved faster than weather. In a coffee shop near the square, I overheard women whispering that I'd been left because I couldn't keep a man happy, that I was unstable, that I was drifting. The words followed me like smoke. As Christmas approached, my mother called often, overly cheerful in a way that sounded rehearsed. She reminded me about Christmas dinner, the guest list, the time, the importance of everything being perfect. When I offered to help, she brushed me off. When I asked what I could bring, she paused and suggested napkins, as if my only safe contribution was something disposable. In the days leading up to the dinner, I wrapped gifts in my small kitchen with cheap paper and careful ribbon, trying to carry love into a place that rarely welcomed it. I bought my father a vintage set of wrenches that reminded me of his hands when I was little. I bought my mother a hand-painted ornament from a local artist. For Daniel and his fiancée, Victoria Hayes, I found a silver picture frame, hoping it might hold something real. Victoria's family had money and status. Her father was a respected doctor, her mother a prominent figure in charity circles, and I could tell my mother was thrilled to host them, thrilled to stand near their shine. I rehearsed how I'd share my job news, not as a plea, but as a fact. I told myself I would walk into that house with my head up. On Christmas Day, the drive to Maplewood Drive felt like returning to a place that looked familiar, but no longer belonged to me. My parents' house was outlined in twinkling lights, garland wrapped tight, oversized nutcrackers guarding the steps. A photographer stood by the driveway, adjusting a camera, breath visible in the cold air. My stomach tightened as I realized this wasn't a family gathering. It was a production. When the door opened, Daniel hugged me quickly, smiling like a man used to being admired. Victoria stepped forward in a cream dress and pearls, her smile flawless and practiced. Her compliment about my coat landed sweetly, but something about the way she said it made me feel like the coat was doing all the work, and I was just a hanger beneath it. Inside, the living room looked staged for a magazine. A tall tree with coordinated ornaments, a mantel arranged with perfect candles, crystal glasses lined up like soldiers. Conversations flowed like scripts about careers, weddings, residencies, charity events, and trips to Italy. Every time I tried to contribute, the room slid past my words like they were mist. When I finally mentioned my new job offer, people smiled politely and moved on, as if I'd announced I'd bought a new toaster. Then I heard my mother, bright and proud, casually telling Victoria's parents that the old Mitchell house on Oakwood Avenue, a property worth nearly $450,000, would of course be under Daniel's management. She said it like it had always been decided, like my name didn't exist on the same family tree. Something cold settled in my chest. I sat there, realizing I wasn't just overlooked. I was being erased in real time, in front of guests, with my mother smiling as if erasing me was tidy and sensible. And I understood, with a clarity that made my hands go still, that whatever happened at dinner tonight wasn't going to be a small hurt I swallowed and carried home. It was going to be the moment the truth finally demanded space. Dinner began with my mother's favorite kind of flourish, the kind that made her feel like the center of a room, even when she wasn't the one being praised. She carried in the first platter of turkey as if she were presenting a trophy, her emerald dress catching the chandelier light, her smile polished and wide. The dining room looked staged, down to the smallest detail. Silverware gleamed like mirrors. Crystal glasses threw tiny sparks of light across the white tablecloth, and place cards sat at each setting in my mother's looping handwriting. When I found my seat between Aunt Linda and Mrs. Hayes, directly across from Daniel and Victoria, it was impossible not to notice who had been positioned where, like a portrait arranged to tell a specific story. Daniel and Victoria were centered, framed by the Hayes family's quiet authority and my parents' eager pride. I was placed neatly on the side, close enough to be seen, but not important enough to shape anything. As plates were passed and wine was poured, the conversation turned into what it always became in our house, a parade of accomplishments. Ethan Carter, my cousin, held court with stories about high-profile legal work, describing long hours and strategic wins in a tone that expected admiration and received it. My uncle laughed loudly, his pride spilling out with every nod. Victoria spoke about her pediatric residency, her voice calm and practiced as she described overnight shifts, call schedules, and the kind of exhaustion that somehow sounded noble when she said it. My mother leaned toward her with shining eyes, praising her for being the perfect example of what a young woman should be, balancing a demanding career while planning a wedding. Each compliment landed like a soft slap, because it didn't only elevate Victoria, it quietly defined me as the opposite. I tried to stay steady, to breathe through it, to wait for an opening. When Aunt Linda finally asked about my new role in Dayton, I felt a thread of hope. I began explaining the position, the responsibility, the clients I'd be managing, how the company was growing fast, how this job was the first real step forward I'd had in months. But before I could finish, Henry Carter, further down the table, chuckled and dismissed it with a careless wave of his fork. He said small firms came and went, that startups were risky, that if I wanted real stability, I should have aimed for established names instead of flashy little experiments. The words stung with a familiarity that made my throat tighten. Ethan smirked and added something about hoping I had a backup plan. A few people chuckled, not loudly, but enough. That was always how it went. The humiliation delivered in a tone that allowed everyone to pretend it wasn't cruelty. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to say the company had steady contracts, that I'd earned the offer, that I wasn't a reckless girl scrambling for scraps. But years of being trained to keep the peace held my tongue for half a second too long, and in that half second, the room moved on, sliding back to safer topics. Victoria's dress fittings, Daniel's Italy plans, the Hayes family's charity circuit. My effort evaporated into polite noise. I looked down at my plate, forcing myself to keep my face calm, even as something bitter tightened inside my chest like a fist. Then Dr. Hayes shifted his tone, leaning back in his chair as if he were about to deliver wisdom everyone had been waiting for. He spoke about how by your late 20s, you should already be settled, how life rewarded people who stayed the course, how wise choices created stability. He nodded toward Daniel and Victoria like they were proof. Around the table, the approval came quickly. My father's low hum of agreement, Aunt Linda's soft smile, my mother's satisfied look, as if this sermon confirmed everything she'd ever believed. No one said my name, but the message pressed against me from every angle. The words weren't advice. They were judgment, neatly dressed as principle. The room felt smaller. The chandelier light seemed sharper. I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, each second a steady reminder that I was trapped at this table, trapped in a role I'd been assigned long before tonight. I stared at the apple pie placed in front of me, its golden crust perfect, the scent of cinnamon rising in a way that should have felt comforting. Instead, it made my stomach turn. The same smells that once meant safety now felt as con to be part of the performance, props in a scene where I was always cast as the failure. My mother stood then, and the scrape of her chair against the hardwood silenced the table more efficiently than any announcement. Every head turned to her. She lifted her glass, shoulders back, her face glowing with the kind of pride she wore at church functions and charity banquets. I recognized that look. It was the look she had when she believed she was about to say something important, something that would impress her audience. My breath hitched, because somewhere deep inside me, I already knew what she was going to do, and still a part of me begged the universe to be wrong. Her voice filled the room with theatrical sweetness as she began. Since everyone was being so honest tonight, maybe it was time someone said what needed to be said. She paused to let anticipation bloom. The silence stretched, thick and expectant. I felt my pulse in my ears. Her smile widened, and then she laughed, sharp, delighted. and declared, "We're ashamed of you." For a moment, nothing moved. Forks hovered. A glass clinked faintly against a plate, and then stopped. The words hung in the air like smoke. Heat rushed into my face so fast it felt like being slapped. I looked around the table, searching for someone to interrupt, to protest, to soften it with even a single sentence. My father lowered his eyes, jaw tightening, but he said nothing. Daniel shifted uncomfortably and then looked down at his plate. Victoria's composure stayed intact, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, as if this was merely an awkward moment to endure. Mrs. Hayes folded her napkin neatly in her lap, her polite expression barely changing. Dr. Hayes sipped his wine, as if his earlier lecture still stood untouched. Then a small ripple of laughter came, Ethan's low chuckle first, smug and entertained. Another forced half-laugh followed, and that was all it took. The room didn't erupt, but it didn't defend me either. Their silence, their tiny sounds of amusement, their refusal to challenge her, all blended into the same message. They agreed. Even the ones who didn't laugh accepted it as acceptable. Something inside me went very still. I gripped the edge of my chair until my knuckles whitened. My wine glass trembled when I reached for it, the pale liquid shaking dangerously near the rim. I tried to inhale and felt like the air stopped at my throat. Shame flooded me, not because I believed her words, but because I realized how easily she could say them and how easily everyone could let her. This wasn't a private cruelty whispered in a hallway. This was a public verdict, delivered with a toast, stamped with the approval of every quiet face at the table. And then, through the heat and the humiliation, another sensation rose. Sharp, steady, almost calm. It was the feeling of reaching a limit. Years of swallowing words, years of being the one who made things easier for everyone else, years of carrying their disappointment like it was my duty, condensed into one clear truth. Silence had never protected me. It had only made it easier to hurt me. If they wanted a scapegoat, it was because they needed someone to carry what they couldn't bear to face about themselves. I pushed my chair back, and the sound cut through the room like a blade. Every head snapped toward me. My legs trembled as I stood, but my voice surprised even me when it came out steady, low, controlled. I looked directly at my mother and repeated her words as a question I already knew the answer to, telling her if she wanted shame, she should learn what it actually looked like. Her smile faltered, glass hovering midair. The uncertainty that flickered across her face fed the fire inside me. For the first time all night, the room wasn't moving past me. Every eye was on me, waiting. And in that charged silence, I realized I wasn't begging for a place at their table anymore. I was holding the match to the stage they'd built, and I was done protecting it. The words came out of me without heat or hysteria, just a quiet precision that made them land harder than shouting ever could. I told her shame was not a divorced daughter rebuilding her life, but a mother who thought no one noticed how she dressed for her tennis lessons years ago, how she lingered too long, how she smiled at her phone when she thought no one was watching. I said I was 19 then, young but not blind, and I remembered the nights my father stayed late at work because he already knew. A gasp moved through the table like a sudden wind. My father's fork slipped from his hand and clattered against the china, the sound loud and brittle in the silence that followed. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The truth had been waiting too long. I turned to my father, my voice still steady, and spoke about the years he drank himself to sleep, the way the house smelled of whiskey, even when the lights were off, the bottles hidden behind boxes of Christmas decorations in the garage. I asked him quietly if he thought I hadn't noticed when he tucked me in, when his breath carried something heavier than exhaustion. His shoulders folded inward, as if the words had pressed down on him physically. He didn't deny it. He didn't defend himself. His silence finally told the truth he'd buried for years. Then I faced my brother. Daniel's confident posture had already collapsed into something smaller, his eyes darting, his mouth opening and closing without sound. I reminded him of the night years ago when his fiancée had confronted him about rumors, and he'd come running to me, panicked, asking me to help him cover his tracks. I said her name out loud, the woman he'd sworn was nothing, and watched the color drain from Victoria's face as she turned to look at him. I mentioned the late-night messages he'd sent me just weeks ago, telling me he felt trapped, unsure if he even wanted to get married. I told him calmly that I still had those messages. The room froze completely. The smugness that had floated so easily earlier evaporated. Ethan's smirk vanished. Mrs. Hayes gripped her napkin so tightly her knuckles went pale. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat but said nothing, his earlier confidence now curiously absent. No one interrupted me. No one laughed. The chandelier light glinted off crystal and silver, cold and unforgiving, as if the room itself was exposing every crack. I looked back at my mother. Her glass trembled in her hand. The emerald confidence she'd worn like armor moments earlier had fallen away, leaving her face drained and unrecognizable. I told them all that for years they had measured me against standards none of them had lived up to, that they had dressed me in shame to hide their own. I said they had laughed tonight, erased me in front of guests, called me a disappointment, but the truth was simple. The only thing they should be ashamed of was themselves. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence felt heavy enough to bend the air. Then my mother's composure finally broke. Her glass lowered slowly, her shoulders collapsing as a sound escaped her that wasn't polished or controlled. She began to sob, the kind of crying that tears through carefully maintained appearances. Mascara streaked down her cheeks as she covered her face with her hands. The performance she loved so much reduced to something raw and exposed. The room didn't rush to comfort her. Everyone looked stranded, unsure of where to place their eyes, their loyalty, their hands. My father stared at his plate as if it could swallow him whole. Daniel sat rigid, staring at nothing, while Victoria's gaze stayed fixed on him, colder and sharper by the second. The future they'd been celebrating minutes earlier visibly cracked, the shine draining from it. I stood there, strangely calm, watching the wreckage settle. The humiliation I'd carried for so long was no longer mine. It had been returned to its rightful owners. I reached for my purse and slid it over my shoulder, my movements slow and deliberate. Then I gathered the stack of wrapped gifts I'd brought, the ones chosen with care, the ones meant to earn me a place. I held them against my arm, feeling their weight. I told them that if the truth made them ashamed, then I was proud to be that shame. The words cut cleanly through the room, and no one tried to stop me. I pushed my chair back, the scrape loud and final. I walked past the tree, its lights still blinking cheerfully, oblivious to the collapse unfolding beneath them. At the doorway, I paused and looked back once. My mother was bent over her plate, sobbing openly now. My father sat hollow and small. Daniel couldn't lift his head. Victoria's ring caught the light, still brilliant, but no longer certain. The guests shifted uncomfortably, already calculating how to escape the ruins of an evening they'd expected to admire. I stepped into the hallway, then out into the cold night air. Snow crunched beneath my boots as I walked toward my car, the winter air sharp and clean in my lungs. For the first time that night, breathing felt easy. The house behind me glowed with lights, but it looked empty now, like a stage after the actors had fled. I sat in the driver's seat with my hands on the steering wheel and understood something that settled deep and steady inside me. I had spoken. The truth had landed, and whatever came next, I would no longer carry their silence for them. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, as if a storm had torn through my life and left behind an unfamiliar stillness. The morning after Christmas, Daniel called me early, his voice low and urgent, telling me I had to help him, that Victoria wouldn't answer his messages, that everything was falling apart. He said I'd ruined his life. I listened without interrupting, noticing how familiar his panic sounded, how easily he reached for me when things broke. When he finally stopped talking, I told him calmly that his choices had consequences and that this was not something I could fix for him. I ended the call without apologizing, and for the first time, the guilt I'd been trained to feel never arrived. By the end of that week, news traveled through the family in fragments. Victoria had quietly stepped back from the engagement. Her parents supported her decision, offering my parents nothing more than polite distance. The alliance my mother had worked so hard to showcase dissolved almost overnight. My father sent me a letter 2 weeks later, the handwriting shaky but careful. He admitted to the drinking, to the years of pretending, to seeing my pain and doing nothing. He wrote that he had started attending meetings in a church basement, that he was trying to face what he'd avoided for too long. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He simply said he was sorry, not for appearances, but for me. I held that letter until the paper softened at the edges. It wasn't closure, but it was real. My mother responded differently. Through a cousin, I heard she had contacted an attorney, claiming the old Mitchell house should belong solely to Daniel, that I was unstable and unfit to handle anything important. The old fear stirred, but it didn't root itself the way it once would have. At work in Dayton, I confided in a colleague named Karen, who listened without judgment and introduced me to her husband, a real estate lawyer. Over coffee one evening, he explained my grandparents' will in clear terms. Unless I signed away my rights, I remained a legal heir. My mother's maneuvering could not erase me. Knowing that steadied me in a way I hadn't expected, like discovering I'd been standing on solid ground all along without realizing it. Around that same time, I began therapy with Dr. Rachel Kim. During our first session, I told her everything, from the marriage to the Christmas dinner that collapsed into truth. She listened quietly and then explained something that shifted how I saw my entire life. She called it the scapegoat role, the way families often choose one person to carry what they refuse to face. She told me it was never about my worth, only about their survival. For years, she said, they had handed me their shame, and on Christmas, I finally set it down. Her words didn't make the past disappear, but they untangled it. I stopped asking myself what I'd done to deserve it. Work became an anchor. At Dayton Digital Solutions, my project spoke louder than any whisper ever had. Clients began asking for me by name. The respect I earned was clean and uncomplicated. Outside of work, my life rooted itself in unexpected places. I started volunteering at the Springfield Community Shelter on weekends, drawn there by a need to be useful in a way that didn't require performing. The shelter smelled like soup and laundry detergent, and the laughter of children echoed through the halls. There was no measuring here, no ranking of worth, just people showing up for one another. It was there that I met Harold Evans, a high school English teacher who ran the literacy program. We talked while stacking boxes, then over coffee at a diner, then during long walks that felt easy in a way I'd almost forgotten was possible. Harold listened when I spoke about my family, about the Christmas that changed everything. He didn't rush to fix it or frame it. One night, as snow began to fall around us, he told me I was brave not because I fought back, but because I stopped hiding. The words landed gently, but they stayed. As months passed, my father continued writing, short notes about meetings and small victories. My mother grew quieter, her silence no longer sharp enough to cut me. Christmas of 2024 arrived without the old dread. Instead of driving back to the house on Maplewood Drive, I walked into the shelter with Harold. We decorated tables with paper snowflakes cut by children, served food donated by local bakeries, and laughed until the room glowed with something real. Standing there, Surrounded by people who chose kindness without conditions, I understood something simple and profound. Family was not who shamed you into silence. It was who made room for your truth. If you've ever felt erased, measured, or made small by the people who were supposed to love you, know this: their judgment is not the truth of you. Choosing yourself is not betrayal, it's survival. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe, and tell me your story in the comments. Your voice matters more than you've been taught to believe.